was saying in that opening monologue, the tragedy right now is Iraq, and you better make sure you get the details right. If a lot of people are being flippant about it now, I took Andy Borowitz to task in the opening monologue. I think there are, of course, Bill Kristol as well, and Dick Cheney, and a lot of the people who are spreading information. With us now to help us clear up some of the confusion and help us figure out what to do going forward is Stephen Miles. Stephen is the coalition coordinator for Win Without War, which is a coalition of over 40 organizations formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and equally importantly, in opposition to the underlying national security strategy which created them. He's a veteran of campaign politics. He's a veteran of progressive causes as well as Democratic campaigning, Democratic Party campaigning. He is a graduate of the London School of Economics, where I did not study 1 year, and has academic expertise in humanitarian interventions and Middle Eastern politics. Stephen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Good, and obviously these are dark days in Iraq. And I guess question number one for you is, how predictable was this?
Well, I think if you look back over the kind of the long term of what's happened over the last decade, it's entirely predictable. Whether or not this particular uptick in violence, was foreseeable or not, what was clear from the very first days of the intervention in the war in 2003 is that Iraq was in for some really dark days ahead and some very violent power struggles. So, unfortunately, the very folks, you mentioned some of them in your opening monologue, the very same folks who thought this was all going to be easy and everything was going to go great starting back in 2003 were wrong, and what was entirely predictable back then is, again, unfortunately, coming true in Iraq.
Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, since you had a background in Middle Eastern politics, another thing I did in my opening monologue was a little bit take to task this, and perhaps I should take a second and just explain for those of our listeners who haven't kept up on it. Clearly, there is there are religious and tribal and other splits, geographic splits in the nation we call Iraq. There are multiple affinity groups, for lack of a better term, around religion and historical association and so on. And one of them, this army ISIS, is conducting a very violent uprising against the Iraqi government, and also saying they're going to create a 500-mile path between Baghdad and Syria, and are also doing all sorts of things. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, I feel that since it's our moral obligation to deal with, to a certain extent, the problem we've created, even if that's by going away. I mean, we can talk about what we should do, but one of the things I think that's a misunderstanding, even among on the left, is the idea, well, Sunnis and Shias have been fighting each other for 1,400 years. It's never going to stop. I think it's a little more complicated than that, and I think a lot of it has to do with our involvement. I talked about that a little bit, about our propping up Saddam and so on, Saddam Hussein and so on. But what are your thoughts? I mean, is this uprising, is it mostly tribal? Is it mostly geographic? Is religion a marker for other kinds of conflict? What do you think is behind this?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and we should circle back to what we do, but we should talk about why what's going on is going on. And you're absolutely right to say it's complicated. It's an immensely complicated situation. And the one thing that we should really have noticed over the last decade is that we're very bad at understanding it from the outside. There are a myriad of fault lines out there. One of them is the Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish divide that is commonly talked about, but there's lots of other fault lines. There's lots of divides. There's lots of nationalist feelings. It's a very complicated situation. ISIS has been one of the primary players in the saga, but they're by no means the only one. There's some great reporting out of The Guardian today discussing what's going on in the Sunni community. You have elements, former Iraqi military elements, former government officials, former tribesmen who were leaders in some of the uprisings in the early part of the Iraq War, and then later turned their weapons against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was, of course, the predecessor to ISIS. In the famous, what's sometimes called the Surge or the Sunni Awakening. Those same folks are now fighting on the side of ISIS against the Maliki government for again a myriad of reasons. Some of them are because of the repressive sentiments and repressive policies of the Maliki government. There's some other realities that ISIS is better armed and capable of kind of convincing them to fight when they don't really have a choice. So it's a deeply complicated situation. And the one thing that we really get wrong here in America is that we think that this is something easy, that there's good guys and bad guys, that we can figure out who those are, that we can help the good guys, that we can kill the bad guys with these quote-unquote targeted and precise airstrikes. The reality is that any step we take to get involved is going to enmesh us right in the middle of a messy, complicated civil war, and it's not going to be something that's going to be very easy for us to deal with.
We're talking with Stephen Miles, Coalition Coordinator for Win Without War, and I guess that brings up several interesting points, but the first one is the surge. We had all this discussion a few years ago about the surge. Would it work? Would it not work? And then people were saying, you see, we told you the surge would work, and they interpreted that, especially on the right, to mean an increase in the number of troops. But what went along with the so-called surge was paying a lot of, as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, involved paying a lot of people who had been fighting against the Iraqi central government to stop doing that and maybe fight for them. Is there some truth to that?
Yeah, there's absolutely some truth to that. I mean, it's sometimes called, I said, the Sunni awakening, but really the violence in 2006, 2007 that we in the U.S. often talk about as the surge, a lot of that was decreased by the time any of the extra U.S. troops got there. And what really happened was a lot of the Sunni militias, a lot of the Sunni tribesmen who were fighting on the side of what was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but again, a little bit more complicated than that, but was fighting on their side, sided with the Americans and with the central government against them and began to kind of turn the tide of that insurgency and brought a relative period of calm in some of the sectarian violence that we had seen. The challenge we have now is that ISIS is actually incredibly well funded. By some counts, they're sitting on about $2 billion of reserves. They just took $400 million of cash when they occupied Mosul. So even if we were to try to replicate just that portion again, where we simply tried to pay people to fight on our side instead of the other side's actually incredibly well financed, and that's one of the reasons, for instance, in Syria, ISIS has been so strong, is that they simply pay more than any of the other militias and any of the other movements that are part of the opposition to Assad. And that's been one of their key ways of strengthening themselves. So there's absolutely some truth to that. And the myth out there that simply what happened was we sent a bunch of American soldiers and they solved all the problems is really one that's a detriment, because it's now coming back to harm us, and in the notion that all we have to do again is send American troops into harm's way, and that'll take care of the problem. That's absolutely not going to take care of the problem any more today than it did in 2007.
So part of what's spinning in my head, as you said all this, was, and this is a fact, this is something I didn't know, they got how much money when they took over Mosul?
Yeah, it's estimated to be about $400 million in cash. Obviously, it's in Iraqi currency, not U.S. dollars, but that they got from the central bank in Mosul. They've been looting banks kind of throughout their advance in northern Iraq. They actually have a number of money-making schemes. Kidnapping is one. It brings them actually tens of millions of dollars a year, kidnapping journalists in Syria, for example. They also operate some oil refineries in Syria, and believe it or not, they trade the oil that they're refining with the Assad government and with some Turkish energy brokers for cash as well. So they have a tremendous amount of financial reserves, and it makes them a formidable force.
Well, money talks, and when we come back after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about this and get to solutions with Stephen Miles of the Coalition of Win Without War. But I would also add that ISIS in Iraq has also been waging a surprisingly sophisticated media strategy, including yesterday tweeting out a Photoshop photograph of Michelle Obama, bring back with the hashtag Bring Back Our Humvee because they took some American military Humvees. So these guys are well financed. They know what they're doing, and when we come back, we figure out what we as American citizens should be pushing for. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. We'll be right back. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Stephen Miles, who is the coalition coordinator for Win Without War. Stephen, thanks so much. We're talking about the situation in Iraq. But before we pivot in a moment to solutions, I just want to ask you to comment. I mentioned before we went to break their sophisticated social media campaign. And I think one of the things that people miss when they hear about events in Iraq or when they read the news, whatever, in this country is I think there's a stereotyping that because they're extremists, because they're fundamentalists, because they're so violent and so on, and they really are all of those things. I think that somehow they're stupid, they're easy to defeat, they're unsophisticated. I don't think any of those things are necessarily true. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, I think you're right to stress that these are not, these are not Boy Scouts. These are violent extremists who are doing some pretty despicable things. But you're absolutely right. They are sophisticated, and it does bring us actually to what we're supposed to do. Just over the last week, we saw two things that are clearly attempted provocations to try to entice a broader fight. So there was a series of executions that they undertook earlier in the week, and then a kind of media blitz they did around those, saying that they had killed 1,700 Shiite members of the Iraqi security forces. Now, they certainly performed some executions, and it's clear that they were on a large scale, but most accounts it wasn't 1,700. So you have to think, why would someone brag about that? Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to provoke a sectarian backlash. They're trying to lure Maliki into making this a fight where it is a Shia versus Sunni fight. They can rally Sunnis to their side against the Shias, and then they want to bring us in, and they want to bring the Americans in on the side of the Shia and make this about Iran and America supporting the Maliki government, and make it one big fight. And so that's exactly why they do things like tweet out a picture of Michelle Obama and try to make this about aggression towards America. I mean, they would like nothing more than for us to get deeply involved in this fight in a way we were in the past decade. And then they can once again rally a number of folks who certainly don't want to be on any part of their kind of violent and murderous ways, but will be pulled to their side by their standing up and fighting the great state in America in their message. So I think we need to be careful about that. We need to understand the sophistication, and we need to think about what is in the U.S. interest. What can we do that will be good for the people of Iraq, and what, above all, can we do to first do no harm? And that has to be our guiding principle: is how do we not make this situation worse?
Well, and I think that brings up it's a great point, and I think that and the sort of Hippocratic principle of first do no harm, I think, or stop doing harm is a critically important point. And I guess I've been certainly in the beginning of this hour very rough on the Republicans who started this war and so on. But you mentioned Maliki and sectarianism, and one of the things that I think is important to for people to know is that I would argue, again, feel free to challenge me if you disagree, but I would argue that one of the greatest mistakes that Obama has made since coming into office has been putting too much resource on the side of the Maliki government, where Maliki himself has used his power in some appalling ways. I mean, I think Chelsea Manning had some revelations about that, but I think that we've also seen, just in terms of publicly available knowledge, that Maliki has been vindictive. He's not been inclusive in the way that a successful leader would be to avoid this kind of outcome. So if I were to chide Obama for one thing, and I'm sure I could find more than one in Iraq, but I would say his excessive backing of Maliki. Am I wrong on that? Yeah,
I mean, I think it is important to recognize that that the president, well, I think on the whole has had a very good policy. We did make a decision to stand by Maliki, and we because of our involvement at the time, the last time there were parliamentary elections, got deeply involved with kind of the business of Iraqis sorting out who was going to form the government and who was going to be involved. And in hindsight, backing Maliki over another faction clearly does not look like the right decision. It's probably one you can make an argument that we repeated in Afghanistan with Hamid Karzai as well, and it kind of is just a reminder that despite the best of intentions, and it is clear the president has some truly good intentions here that I think is a major difference than the previous administration, but despite the best of intentions, when you meddle in these countries, when you meddle in their internal politics, you can really have some horrible unintended consequences, and it should be by now a lesson that America has learned about unintended consequences.
Okay, well then, Stephen Miles, Coalition Coordinator for Win Without War, what should we be doing and what should concerned citizens be demanding of their president and representatives that we do?
Well, so two things. First is exactly what I said before. First, do no harm. I mean, there's a bucket of things that kind of feel good in that classic American John Wayne sense of we're going to do something. Airstrikes always sound good and simple. Helping the Iraqis put down quote-unquote terrorists sounds good and simple. But we really need to make sure and take a giant step back that we're not doing harm and really think, and in our opinion, those are options we should not be taking. When it comes to what we should be taking, there's kind of a litany of options. None of them are going to be sufficient by themselves, and the thing we have to do is break ourselves from this notion that there are easy or even good options. There aren't. There is no single solution. But part of the solution is going to be a diplomatic solution to what is now a major regional conflict. You can't talk about Iraq without talking about Syria, and you can't talk about Syria without talking about Iraq. You can't talk about either one without talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the other regional players. What we need to do is go back and look and revisit something like the Dayton process in the Balkans, have a major rethinking and a major sorting out of how we're going to solve this problem diplomatically. And that's going to require some creative thinking, and it's going to require us to focus on that process and not focus on military solutions. We also need to deal with the humanitarian crisis. There are millions of refugees, both internally displaced and in other countries now in the region. The refugees systems for supporting them are woefully underfunded, and they're going to require a massive influx of cash to help support. And so we need to seriously look at that because it is a growing humanitarian crisis. And then ultimately, we're going to need to get people to stop fighting, and we're going to need to find a way to have a ceasefire. That's going to require some serious conversations with the various factions. It's going to require conversations with the parties who are supporting the various factions, and it's going to be a complicated, messy business. But that's that in a nutshell. And many, many, many other things that are going to have to be done by the Iraqis, by the Syrians, decisions they have to make for themselves about their future and the type of country they want to live in. That's the path. The path is clearly not American airstrikes. It's clearly not American special forces. And we need to be thinking a lot more about those other kinds of solutions and a whole lot less about whether we're sending a couple hundred military advisors or whether we're taking some drone strikes.
Okay, so two more questions for you. Number one, 275 troops going in, we're told, to protect our embassy personnel. Worrisome, not worrisome? That's question number one. And question number two, where does Syria fit into all of this?
So, maybe start with Syria. Syria, it's inextricably linked. The border there is very porous. It's very, very desert. The combatants by and large are both in Syria, in both Syria and Iraq. And so, again, this is a regional problem that is going to require a regional solution. And it also brings up kind of the craziness of the concept of, last fall we were talking about bombing in Syria to support Assad, to support the rebels against Assad. In Iraq, we're now talking about bombing the same folks who are rebels in Syria to support the Iraqi government. So, we're talking about a very complex situation.
Right. We're talking about when Hillary Clinton says she disagreed with Obama and thought we ought to bomb Assad in support of the rebels of Syria, I thought she was talking about supporting the same people, a lot of the same people who were talking about attacking in Iraq. And I think you're saying that's true. And so last question, Stephen Miles, A Win Without War. How worried? A lot of people are very concerned that 275 troops. We're told they're defending embassy personnel, but in Vietnam we were told 40 advisors were going to train the South Vietnamese, and that didn't work out very well. So, how concerned should we be?
There's actually two different things. There was early in the week. It was announced that there was 275 troops, mostly Marines, going a traditional embassy security role. That's probably fairly understandable given the circumstances. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is the largest embassy in the world. It's 5,000 personnel. Just the process of evacuating them, if need be, in an emergency, is going to require some folks to help secure that and make sure it happens. But the thing that was announced yesterday is actually different. That's up to 300 special operations forces who will be advisors. Now, these are going to be folks who are going to be broken down into small teams of 10 to 20. They're going to be forward deployed in close coordination with the Iraqi government. And we're told they're going to be doing primarily intelligence missions, but there's still some confusion exactly about what they're going to be doing. But these are not guys there to guard the embassy. These are there to gain a deeper understanding of the conflict, help advise the Iraqis. But we should be concerned about this. You know, this is not base security. These are 300 special operations soldiers. These are, Green Berets, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs. It's unclear the exact makeup, but these are guys who are going to be potentially near the front lines. And we don't know what's going to happen. We have to see what's going to happen as this unfolds. But it's, from our perspective, a troubling development. We're going to have to watch it, and we need to make sure that this does not escalate. Because, as you said, we saw in Vietnam, unfortunately, how advisors can become troops very, very quickly, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen here.
Well, we'll have to end on that. We've seen this movie before. We didn't like how it ends. Let your representatives know you're concerned. Where can people find out more about Win Without War?
We've got our website, www.winwithoutwar.org. .org. You can check out all sorts of information there, and thanks for having me on the show, Richard.
Thank you, and Stephen Miles, thank you for all the great work you guys are doing. We will be right back after this on the Zero Hour.